Likutei Sichos Chelik of Ches, volume 28, the second Sicha for Parshas Naso. This Sicha will explain how in the Mishkan / Beis HaMikdash, every single detail or item was crucial and fully accounted for. In other words, served a particular purpose, and how this relates to our lives. So as an introduction, just to be more familiar with the concepts that will be discussed in the Sicha, when Moshe Rabbeinu instructed Bnei Yisrael regarding the Trumas HaMishkan, all the donations which they were encouraged to give to the Beis HaMikdash, so the Nesim, that's the leaders of the 12 tribes, didn't immediately respond. They didn't immediately bring any donations. Rather, they said, let's see what everybody else brings, and whatever is going to be missing, in other words, whatever they're going to be lacking, we're going to fill that void. At the end, however, as we know, it says Bnei Yisrael brought dai v'hoiser. They brought, not only was it enough, but it was more than enough. It was plentiful. In fact, I had to say to them, please stop bringing more because we have nothing more to do with it. So the Nesiim were kind of left out, and all that was left for them was to bring those precious stones which went into the breastplate and into the shoulder stones of the Kohen Gadol. In our Parsha, however, it tells us how the Nesiim were the ones to be makdim. They went ahead, they sprinted ahead, and they were the first to bring a special gift for the inauguration of the Mishkan. As we'll see in the Sicha, they brought the 6 wagons to help transport the panels of the Mishkan and the sockets and the various beams and the drapery, the tapestry that was used to cover the Mishkan. And with these 6 wagons came along 12 oxen that would pull these wagons, 2 per wagon. Okay, and this obviously was meant to correct their mistake of not having been a little more quick and swift at bringing the donations for the Beis HaMikdash. So that's one thing to be familiar with. Another thing, another concept, we find in the Gemara that in regards to the Beis HaMikdash, in other words, to the general conduct, to the general approach to things, the Gemara says, Ein anius b'mokim ashirus, that you don't behave with a state of mind of poverty in a place of affluency. Meaning the attitude in Beis HaMikdash was in a matter of affluency. An example for it, not one which is discussed in the Sicha, but just as an example, that if one of the garments of the Kohanim became torn or heavily soiled, they wouldn't bother fixing it or, reweaving it or cleaning it, try to take out the stains. Rather, they would discard it and give it a second life as use as wicks or whatever it is. Why? Because it's not appropriate that the uniforms that are being used for the servants of the Beis HaMikdash to be treated like a poor man's garment and start to put on patches, so to speak, or start to fix it like a poor man would do. One more thing to be familiar with, the difference between a nidava and a korban. In regards to in relations to the Mishkan, we find that what the Bnei Yisrael brought as means to build the Mishkan was called a nidava. What is a nidava? A nidava means a gift. Nidava means a contribution, which really is governed, as it says, kifi nidvas liboy shel kol echad ve'echad. It goes in accordance, and it's governed by the generosity of each individual's hearts. That means there's no real definitive measurement, not even criteria per se, as to how much you have to give, how much you shouldn't give, what's more, what's less. However, there is a korban. What is a korban? A korban also is a form of contribution. However, a korban is very, very specific. When you bring an offering, once something is classified as a korban, as we'll see in the Sicha, it has very precise and strict parameters, and it has a criteria as to how much it should be, how much it should not be, what it should be, what it should not be. And if it doesn't conform to all of it, then it's not a korban. And in fact, the Rebbe will suggest in the Sicha, if one brings extra, meaning over the korban, if it's not part of the korban, then you actually not only not doing a mitzvah, but you might be even committing a transgression, because it's machnis chulin la'azara. It's like you're bringing in mundane into the holies, into the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, if it doesn't belong there, if it's not actually part of the carbon, then it doesn't belong there, then it actually is a sin to bring it in. So let's get into the Sikha. In our Parsha, the Parsha tells us how on the day when Moshe completed to erect the Mishkan, this was the final day, the inauguration of the Mishkan, so the leaders of the tribes of Israel, Vayakrivu, they brought forth, or they themselves came close, and they brought Vayaviu es korbanon. Notice this word. They brought their korban before Hashem. What was it? 6 covered wagons and 12 oxen to pull the wagons. And then the Torah tells us, Agola al shnei hayasiyim. Each wagon was for 2 leaders. That means each Nasi essentially offered, gifted only a half a wagon. Together, you can't give a half a wagon, so together each 2 of them brought an entire wagon. So the Rebbe says the whole thing doesn't make sense. We know that when it came to the gifts that they gave to the Mishkan in general, it says that the Yidden gave it with their entire heart. They gave it in abundance, as it says, Dai v'hoiser, even more than they needed. And why here, the Nesiim, when they gave their gift, they gave it with such accuracy, with such precision, such exactness, not more, not less. Why so little? Why 6 wagons? Moreover, the whole reason why they went ahead, they jumped ahead now and gave this offering was to correct their mistake that they made initially by not having contributed, not having been so quick to contribute early on when the contributions were given to the Mishkan. So how is this a way to correct their past mistake by being so frugal, or what seems to be being frugal? To add to the question, what was the whole purpose of these wagons? What was done with these wagons? They carried the boards of the Mishkan. And therefore, it had to be divided up very, very precisely, as the Torah tells us. 2 wagons went to the family of Gershon, because they carried the tapestries, and they carried certain other objects, like the sockets and so on. And then the 4 wagons went to the children of Merari. They carried the boards, the walls of the Mishkan. Now in the Gemara goes into lengthy detail, a whole lengthy discussion as to exactly how it was divided up, how they piled up the boards. That the Gemara makes an in other words, a precise calculation of the space that was available and how much each wagon can carry, to the point that the Gemara says that it was so precise that they would pile up the boards in such a manner, because there was only a certain amount of wagons. There was only 4 for the Bnei Merari, for the children of Merari. And therefore the Gemara concludes, a Levi, if not more than one Levi, had to actually walk alongside the wagons. It wasn't like you put it in a tractor trailer on a flatbed, you tie it down, and the driver gets into the cab and just drives off and doesn't have to look back until he arrives at his destination. Here they had to actually walk alongside it, and it was so crucial to make sure that it didn't move, it didn't shift. And if it would shift, then they would have to stop everything and climb up, squeeze themselves in, and straighten it out. If not, the whole thing would topple. So, in other words, to keep it stable, they had to actually follow along. The Levim didn't just, pile it up onto the wagons and forget about it until they reached the final destination. But they had to actually walk alongside it. And the question is, it would seem that this type of approach is almost like behaving with a poor man's mindset in a place of affluency. As we said, there's ain't any use for Malkim Ashiras. Now, in the answer, to begin to understand, to process through the answer, in Sifri, and likewise in the Medrash, these are 2 types of Medrashim, we learn out from the Pasuk where Hashem says to Moshe, Kach me'itom. Hashem said to Moshe, take from them, take the wagons, take this gift from the Nesiim. From there we learn that initially Moshe did not want to accept it. And Hashem said to them, to Moshe, Kach me'itom, take from them. In other words, they had an idea that is consistent with my idea. In other words, they imagined this idea. They decided to do this, but really what their thinking was parallel to my thinking. And if this, according to this, it comes out that whatever they came up with, in other words, the number of wagons they came up with is consistent with Hashem's desire, with Hashem's will. Now, but of course, like everything else, it cannot be that it was just like almost like a choik, like a statute. This is what Hashem wants, 6, and for no reason. There has to be a reason. Even if this is consistent with Hashem's will, Hashem wants things for a certain reason. What could be the reason behind it? Why precisely 6? Why not more? Why just have more wagons and fill it up in a very pleasant and broad manner, in a way that the Levim don't have to work hard while it's traveling and not worry about it toppling and so on and so forth. Moreover, if you think about it, the fact that they first thought about it before they came to find out that it's Hashem's thinking, that really they came up with Hashem's idea, so to speak. So they obviously had a rational reason. They had a logic behind coming up with this number. What would be their logic? What would be their rationale to come up with this precise number of 6 wagons and therefore only 12 oxen, 2 per wagon, not more, not less? We need to understand what this precision is all about, because on the surface it seems to be just plain outright frugality. To such an extent, as we see that it was so precise, like I said before, that the Gemara makes that whole calculation as to how these boards were piled up exactly, precisely how much space they took up, and where there was space for a Levi to climb into if he needed to straighten them out. What is the reason for this? Why? To understand this, says the Rebbe, we'll preface by presenting a distinct difference between the way the Sifri versus the Medrash present the story here. In the Sifri, it says as follows. Follow these words. What exactly did the Nesiim, did the leaders see? In other words, what caused them to give this destination immediately at the beginning versus what happened when it came to the donations of the Mishkan? So note over here, how does the Sifri present what the leaders gave? It presents it as a donation, as a contribution, versus the Medrash that uses the following words. Why Lama Nizdar Zonesim? Why did the Nesim have this haste to come and to be makriv? Makriv means like a korban, to offer in the beginning before anyone else. And when it came to the contributions to the Mishkan, they seemed to be a little lazy and they didn't bring right away. So you see that according to the Sifri, the 6 wagons and the 12 oxen, they have the status, they have the gather of a contribution, and according to the Medrash, they have the status, they have the gather of a korban. Okay, even more emphasized later, as it says in the Medrash, just to point it out even more. This is not just a fluke, but in fact, the Medrash is consistent with the fact that it relates to it, it refers to it as a korban, and it says as follows: once the Mishkan was completed, they went ahead and they brought their korban, the korban Nesim, bizrizus, in great zrizus, in great haste. And this is what it says the Medrash, Vayakrivu Nisi Yisrael. This is why it says Vayakrivu. It doesn't say Vayaviu, they brought, you bring a contribution. Vayakrivu means usually you brought a korban. Now, according to the Medrash also, we find another very interesting thing, that it says Moshe was concerned. What's going to happen if one of the wagons break? What's going to happen if one of the oxen die? And therefore Hashem says to him, Kach mitam v'hoyu, and they will be. In other words, Hashem didn't say like they shall be, but he was also giving him a promise. They will be, they will last, and they will last and last on. In other words, this korban will never become defiled. This korban will never become diminished. Because we know in general, whenever something has the status of a korban, if it's missing even one aspect of it, the entire korban is incomplete. And that gives us a little insight that according to the Medrash, this had the status of a korban. In fact, there's a discussion and there's a whole debate as to when exactly those oxen were later slaughtered after the 40 years. What happened with them? So one thing about the wagons, okay, they went somewhere, they were burnt, they were used as fire, but what happened to the oxen? But just to show you that according to the Medrash, this had together of a korban. Not only from the presenter's point of view, not only because of the Nisim that they brought it and they felt it was a korban, but you see how here he had the status of a korban in the object itself, to the extent that Moshe had to be reassured this korban will never be diminished. So, because it was a korban, now we appreciate, at least according to the Medrash, why it had to be precise. Not more and not less. Not bigger and not smaller. What is the explanation of this? What does this all mean? You see, the Medrash tells us that when it came to the completion of the Mishkan, immediately they went ahead and they brought the 6 wagons and the 12 oxen. And the Medrash continues and it says, who gave him this idea? Who gave him this advice? It was the tribe of Yisachar, who were the scholars, that they said to them, listen, the Mishkan that we just made, the way it is right now, it's basically Peireach Ba'avir. It's like floating in the air. It's flying in the air. And therefore, donate, or really bring as an offering these wagons, so now they should be a means of transportation. What does that mean? What did Yisachar exactly tell them? And how does this fit into the idea of a korban? You see, the idea of giving wagons to transport the boards and the sockets and the tapestry was not, so to speak, an add-on to the idea of the Mishkan. Rather, it is part and parcel. It is an inherent part or aspect of the Mishkan. You see, what's the whole point of it? The whole idea of the Mishkan was that it should be mobile, transportable. And if so, that's what Yisachar was saying to them. To be mobile and transportable, you could take it down and put it up and it can travel with them. How was it supposed to get from one place to another? Even though there wasn't a precise directive from Hashem, but Yisachar says to them, you understand that inherently in the building of the Mishkan has to come with it vehicles with which to transport it. Otherwise, it's going to be flying in the air. Is that what you expect, all the boards to float in the air? And therefore, giving these wagons is like part of making the Mishkan. And this is parallel to the idea of a korban that we see also in our parsha, that in order to complete the making of the Mishkan, to inaugurate the Mishkan, they brought korbanos, meaning the Mizbeach is for the purpose of korbanos. So in order for the Mizbeach to be complete, in order for the Mishkan to be complete, the Nesiim brought a whole regimen of korbanos throughout the 12 days consecutively. So likewise, according to the way the Medrash understands it, and that's why we can appreciate why it has to be a precise number, 6 and not more and not less, is because this is a korban, this is a completion, this is the finishing touch of the whole making of the Mishkan. And that's why it has the obvious exact amount. Because if they would bring a little more, remember what we said in the introduction, bringing more to a adding more to a korban is not only not a virtue, but it can actually be a problem. Because you are now bringing into the holies, you're bringing into the Azara Cholin, you bring it so that it doesn't belong there. If it's not part of the korban, it doesn't belong there. And that's how they knew that it has to be exact. That everything has to be utilized to its ultimate capacity. And even the oxen, only 2. Because they met the way they were able to calculate it, distributing the weight between the ability of each ox individually and both of them together collectively, they figured how those 2 oxen are able to carry that amount of weight, not more a lot and not less. Now, this all explains it according to the Medrash. But now we need to understand according to the Sifri, and even according to where Rashi brings it, that since they had the status of a contribution, then how will we explain? Why did it have to be so precise, or what appears to be so frugal, so exact? The answer is, what was this used for? Whom was this allocated to? Hashem said, give this to the Leviim. As we said, the family of Gershon, the family of Merari, right? And depending on how big their job was and how great the capacity was, they received more wagons, 4 versus 2. Now, the job of the Leviim is Lasei Ses HaMishkan. The job of their task is to carry the Mishkan. So when Hashem said, take the wagons and give it to the Leviim, It wasn't Hashem's intention, chas v'shalom, to take away their purpose, to remove the Levim's purpose and contribution to the Mishkan. Rather, it was his intention to lighten the load on them. Instead of them having to carry the boards on their back, like Bnei Kahas carry the Kalim of the Mishkan, now Hashem says we have an assistance for them. We have something to help them in the transportation of all these items. However, not to totally alleviate them from this, that they just load up the wagons and it just happens on its own, because in that case, from one station to another station, the Leviim are out of work. The Leviim are out of service of the Mishkan. And we know that their service is to serve the Mishkan. Rather, what Hashem said is, give it to them to make their load easier, but not to totally eliminate it. And therefore, the fact that the Leviim have to walk alongside because it was exact, and make sure that it doesn't topple, it doesn't shift, and therefore it doesn't collapse the whole load, that was their continuance of their service of the carrying of the Mishkan. And therefore, even though typically in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, the attitude is ein anius b'makom ashirus, that you always, you don't behave in a frugal manner in a place of great affluence, but still, here, the Nesiim understood, according to the Sifri, that they have to give an exact amount in order not to eliminate, not to take away from the Leviim their ability to continue doing their task of carrying the Mishkan, or being part of the process of carrying and transporting the Mishkan. What is the lesson for us? The lesson for us, as it says in Gemara Shabbos, Kol ma shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu lo'olam lebara dav rechel v'atola. That whatever Hashem created in this world, He didn't create anything for naught. Everything in this world, especially in matters of Kedusha, as exemplified in what we discussed above regarding the Mishkan, has a purpose and has therefore a reason for being here, and has something for us to be done with it. And this gives us the lesson, says the Rebbe, that each person has the tafkid, each person has the purpose of fulfilling the ultimate idea of the Mishkan, which is v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'sheicha, that Hashem says He should make a Beis Hamikdash and I will dwell amongst them, in each and every single Jew. And therefore, and each and every single Jew has to bring the Shekhinah into the world, in his space and around him, whatever he encounters in the world. And therefore, the lesson is that each and every person has to fully utilize all their potential, all their talents, to make this Mishkan in this world. And this is not only your potential, your talents, and your abilities, but also even in your time. The Rebbe gives an example. Imagine that a person spent his time very well throughout the day. It was fully accomplished. 23 hours and 59 minutes accounted for between everything they're doing in this world, whether it's sleeping, whether it's eating, whether it's learning Torah, whether it's working with others. All was a purposeful thing. You have 1 minute left. That minute shouldn't go to waste. That minute should also be serving its purpose and the person's mission in this world of the Shechanti B'Seichom, that you bring the Mishkan, you bring the Shekhinah into the world. The bottom line is that if a person does not fully utilize all their talents, their time, and all the potential that they have, not only does it affect them negatively, but it could also impact the general purpose of bringing the Mishkan into the world. In other words, it affects the entire universe, that it doesn't allow the full extent of Asuli Mikdash Shechanti B'Seichom. However, when every single person utilizes all their potential, all their talent, all their abilities, all their time that they have, in order to bring about the Shechanti B'Seichom, this, of course, first of all brings the Shekhinah down here now, but of course will also lead to the ultimate bringing down the Shekhinah in the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi B'Karev Mamish.